Okay, we are streaming. Give me 1 second to put it in board docs and then we can begin.
Christina, if you can just give me a thumbs up when we're ready to go. I'm having some audio issues, but I just visually can see you.
Hold on.
Was that the thumbs up? Sorry.
No. Okay, thumbs up. Oh, look at that.
Right. It sounds like we are ready to go. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Welcome to the Legislative Task Force Committee meeting. We are so excited to be here. We have a bit of a large agenda, so we want to make sure we get to it. I want to welcome everyone who's here today. Today, we're going to be focusing a little bit of our work on what we're going to be championing at the legislative session. Often we talk about what are the needs of Hartford Public Schools and what are the resources that we need. And a lot of the ways we are able to do that is by doing that at the legislative level and getting together to figure out what those goals are, what we're hoping to achieve together is really important ahead of next year's legislative session. So to keep it pretty simple, because we do have a lot to go through and we only have 1 hour and I want to honor everyone's time. And I apologize if you can hear background noise. I am in the heart of the city, so I apologize for that.
You sound fine. Your sound
and so
is
essentially, I'm going to pass it over to our lobbyists in this moment who are going to go over. We've had some pre-meetings about what it is that we needed to focus on. We listened to all of you based on the agendas that we've had in the past. We also met together to figure out what are some of those top concerns. And then sort of we distilled it in what it is that we can do this year. And then what it is that we can do moving forward, both offensively and defensively to add resources to Hartford Public Schools, but also defend some of the things that we have to keep those continuing resources and resources to stay in the district. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to our lobbyist, who's going to talk, Nicole, who's going to talk through a document we put together. And the hope would be that you'll have an opportunity to hear it, react to it, and then figure out what next steps will look like.
Thank you, Krista.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Patrick.
And Nicole, if you can take over.
We're good?
Is the superintendent trying to talk?
Oh, superintendent, you're
You're
on mute. Or maybe he's on the phone.
Maybe he's on another call.
Yeah. I'm going to walk over just to be sure, but in the meantime, Patrick or Nicole.
Okay. Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Patrick McCabe, partner at Capital Strategy Group, here with Nicole Tomasetti, my partner. Thank you to Krista and Christina for the planning and prep for this meeting and lining up, beginning to figure out what the agenda ought to be for this group, and that's why we're here today to discuss some ideas with you and get a lot of feedback, and look forward to working with you all and moving the agenda of the Hartford Public Schools forward at the legislature this year. So Nicole and I are going to go through goals and priorities for this year, proposed, and then obviously it will be up to this group to make decisions as to what we'll be pursuing. So Nicole is going to talk about some offensive goals. I'll talk about some of the defensive goals and some other issues, and then Nicole will then talk about the legislative session and run through the timeline. I know many of you are familiar with the legislature and the timeline, but I thought we could just to level set with that today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to talk about the proposed offensive goals.
Thanks, Patrick. So as Krista noted, we have both offensive goals and some defensive goals for this legislative session. I'll go over some of the offensive goals, which we kind of defined as policies and priorities that are intended to bring additional resources to Hartford Public Schools to better serve our students and begin to address some of the inequities built into our current system. Some of these goals focus on immediate needs, while others will be part of a multi-year approach. That's because we have heard, folks, when you have voiced many times that really this issue is much deeper than a few policy proposals or a few line items in a budget, and that this is something that needs to be kind of reiterated year after year, but also moving towards a more equitable system. And that was the intent of the offensive goals. So first goal is special education. We know that was a priority last year, but we want to come back and make sure that those new seed grants that were established last year are fully funded. Right now they're funded, but not fully, as well as making sure that the excess cost grant, which is currently already in effect, a policy that we also would like to have fully funded. This would allow additional resources to Hartford to better serve our students. And the goal would also be to make sure we're advocating for that funding to go right to the Board of Education, to Hartford Public Schools, so that the BOE has, direct control over how it's allocated towards special education services. Another is busing. This is something that Krister has brought up as a big priority this year. So securing additional funding for transportation costs for students, particularly for door-to-door transit. There's been a pilot program with the state of Connecticut for CT fast track buses, but more needs to be done to make sure kids can get to school safely, and that if they don't have other resources to get a ride, that the school is providing those. And then finally, and this is more of a broader goal for long-term, but to amplify concerns about the disparate impact of current funding mechanisms on communities like Hartford, those with lower income communities, as well as multi-language learners. So that's kind of what I meant about reinforcing the broader message that we really, these systems, we're working within broken systems, and that we're really patching things with a Band-Aid, but continuing to beat the drum that transformational change really needs to happen as well. I'll toss it back to Patrick to go over defensive goals.
Thanks, Nicole. And again, we'll obviously there'll be discussion following this and questions, but if we can run through this, it's probably the best way to organize today. So defensive goals are focused around the idea that we want to maintain the funding that we have, continue to push back on unfunded mandates, and to continue to educate legislators about the issues, and they must remain top priorities for Hartford. And again, given the uncertainty, as Nicole has mentioned earlier, of what is going to happen at the federal level as that money, comes or doesn't come back to the state, and as we look to not an uncertain budget year. And Nicole will talk a little bit about that later. It is an off-year budget, but there will be adjustments. We certainly will be budget adjustments this year, and we need to pay close attention to those. We want to prioritize the continued funding because it ensures obviously stability in the system, and we don't want to lose any ground. So there are two major issues that we need to continue to make sure they stay in place. Maintain the fully funding of the ECS formula that has broad support. We don't anticipate that is going to be impacted. You have a strong delegation in Hartford, led by the speaker and the education chair, Doug McCrory, and others. And then just as important, sustaining the 58% cap on the general education magnet tuition. That is something that is always in play, really, because of the competing interests for the limited education funding in the Hartford region. A couple other issues that we will keep on the radar screen. In addition, there are always issues that we don't necessarily anticipate and that present themselves, but ones that we definitely want to keep an eye on to continue to explore and socialize concern about educational mandates and how they impact Hartford Public Schools budget. Maintaining access to the federal programs like school lunch and breakfast, SNAP, Medicaid, behavioral health services. Again, the importance of what is going to transpire in Washington over the next few months. It's still very unclear, obviously, and that is something that agencies throughout the state are worried about, and systems throughout the state. So we're obviously want to make sure we're at the front of the line. And then maintaining and family safety despite increased federal presence of ICE. Policy examples of this would be the state policies on ICE in schools and courthouses. Again, we will just keep an eye on those things, not necessarily making them either on the offensive agenda, but something we need to pay attention to. Nicole, why don't you go ahead and give some background on the on the budget? I mean, I'm sorry, on the session, and then go through, I think, timelines.
Sure,
Please.
thanks. Yeah, thanks. And since we are going to speak to the budget a little bit, I will mention, because I made a note, but I didn't share it. So the seed grants, I said they're not fully funded. They're funded currently at 30 million annually, versus the fully funded, which would be 190 million annually. So it results in districts being proportionally reduced. I think the average is like roughly 15% of whatever a fully funded grant would be. That's what the districts are actually getting right now with current funding. So as Patrick mentioned, it's an off year for the budget. The session begins February 4th and it ends May 6th. So it's a faster session than the session that we experienced last year. That's because in the shorter years, they don't actually go in and create a new budget. Our budget is biennial, so it is drafted for every 2 years. But during the session, they can go in and make revisions to that budget based on updated revenue forecasts or additional needs, or policy changes. In regular and off budget years, legislators cannot introduce individual bills. So legislative committees are required to do that. So that means usually leadership of a committee. So because we have majority Democrats both chambers, usually the Democrats will have to, be willing to raise that bill in order for it to be heard. And then, as you guys who have gone through session with us before might be familiar, there's some key committees that we usually interact with. These aren't the only committees. Sometimes we see issues pop up in the Human Services Committee or the Children's Committee, and we keep an eye on those things as well. But our key committees really are, the Education Committee. That committee is the committee that creates kind of the baseline for all the policies. And then there's also the Select Committee on Special Education. That's a special committee that was created by the speaker last year. It's chaired by State Rep Miriam Khan, as well as Senator Gadkar Wilcox. Rep Khan is obviously part of the Hartford delegation. And that is the committee that worked on those seed grants last year. So they will be meeting again this year. This is probably their last year, but they will probably, continue to look at policy priorities as well as budget issues. I'm sure we'll see Rep Khan come back and advocate for some sort of additional funding for those seed grants. And then the Appropriations Committee, as we stated, it's not a full budget crafting year, but the committee does meet to review the budget and make revisions. And then finally, the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee, and that's the committee that covers school construction bonding and any additional taxes. We don't expect to see any taxes this year, but we have in the past seen things like a proposal for a sugary drink tax to fund universal lunches, things like that. We will keep our eyes out because we'll definitely see the proposals. But with current budget projections, I'm not sure there'll be new taxes actually adopted. And then for the session timeline, now this is still a little bit loose only because they haven't announced the official dates yet, but kind of using the previous 2 years calendars and reading the session rules, this is kind of a small estimated deadline. I won't read every date. We can share this with you all afterwards so you can see it. But basically early February 4th, session will start. Second week of February, we'd expect to see public hearings start. They're going to be scheduled probably, first or second day of session. So it's a lot faster than in full session years, which is when we're in from January to June. We wouldn't see public hearings start almost immediately. By mid-February, the Appropriations Committee is meeting and talking about the budget. The governor has also given an address to the legislature and provided any revisions he might have or policy changes he proposes, which the legislature can take those and do with them what they would like. By end of February, committee bill proposals will be due and bills have to be, formally raised by the committee. By early March 10th, public hearings for the Education Committee will end. By March 18th, so mid-March, both Appropriations and Finance, as well as the Special Education Select Committee will probably have wrapped up their public hearings. And then March 21st, that's the date by which Education Committee has to get all their proposed bills out of committee. The money committees usually have a little bit longer. And last year we saw that special education, their final date was actually after the budget committees. And that was to give them enough time to craft their proposal in response to the budget. But by end of March, early April, all those bills will have had to be referred out of committee and sent to the chambers for their vote. I would like to say it'll be earlier, but usually we see the budget revisions would be adopted last week of April, or first week of May, which is right when session ends. It ends on the 6th. And something to look out for and just be aware of. I don't think it'll happen again, but the last time we had a short session in 2024, they actually did not come back and revise the budget at all. Yeah, Patrick, I will hand it to you for any thoughts and comments.
No, the only thing I forgot to mention, remind me when you're talking about the committees, when I mentioned certainly the role of Speaker and Senator McCrory at Education, leading education, when you mentioned the Finance Committee, school construction issues, and his ability to negotiate the budget. Senator Fonfara, of course, been a great champion for the schools, is in a very good position to, with the other leaders there, to help with this the school's agenda through the session. Nicole, do you want to just talk about next steps and then we turn it back to Krista?
Sounds great. Yeah. And then Krista, maybe you can help us facilitate any feedback and comments and thoughts. So just, meeting with Krista and kind of discussing plans for next, we want to discuss and make sure we're like best methods for providing communications to the LNA task force members. We hear you guys that it's a really tight turnaround. So we're going to make sure we can find ways to best get that information about public hearings and events to you as soon as possible, as soon as we know about them, as well as looking at the best way to reach parents, students, other advocacy groups, kind of outside the task force, folks who are engaged and want to testify, and making sure we're getting them the right information and making sure they feel prepared, to testify as well. And then we'll want to discuss just some, background info and some prep we can do in advance of the public hearings, as we said, so people can feel, educated in advance. And then when it's time to be activated, kind of ready to go and feel like they feel informed and know what the next steps are. At this time, I'll pass it back to you, Krista, for thoughts.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Patrick. I know that was a lot of information, and crafting this, we had a meeting with you all, many of you, just sort of thinking through last time and then this time what we think would make sense. And this is sort of what we came up with after we distilled all of that information based on what we know, what we were hoping for, and what we're experiencing at the moment. So we wanted to have a moment where, and I know it was a lot, and you'll have the opportunity to review this, of course, and we know that it's a tight time frame. And we know that there's going to be a lot of moving pieces. So part of what we wanted to do is give you the overall explanation of what's happening, what we're thinking, get your feedback, and then go ahead and go to next steps. I see a question, and we can, Board Member Fortune, you can go right ahead.
Thank you. So with respect to our offensive strategies, I'm very wary of anything that sort of explicitly is saying we want more funding, because I think unfortunately, the mindset at the Capitol is that Hartford already gets more than its fair share and we're just wasteful with that money. It is a view that is completely unsubstantiated, but it is, for whatever reason, it seems to permeate some people there. I think the framing that our CFO has offered is a really good one. We have a structural budget deficit. We should advocate for having the state pay for students, Hartford students, to the districts wherever they attend. Because the deficit that we're incurring is because we're paying tuition out to those districts. So if they don't give us the funds, they just give the funds to whichever school districts our students are going to. So we're not playing middleman of having to pass funds and then the excess cost as well. I think that could be a way that's not explicitly saying we want additional funds, but we just want it to be fair. A child is attending a district outside of Hartford, that money should go directly to that town and not to us for us to in turn pay, because we know that we're paying a lot more than what we're receiving for a lot of the students who are going out of the district. And as I understand it, it's not always clear that these additional services they claim our Hartford students need are always really necessary for them to thrive in those other districts where they find themselves. I still want our students to have the option to go elsewhere because that's what the law currently states. But I think us bearing the financial burden of that at the expense of our students who remain in the district is inherently unfair. And that's a way to frame that. I'll pause for now and curious to hear thoughts and responses to that.
Thank you to that feedback. I will go to board member Chairwoman Brody next, and then we can go back around to that.
Hello. I appreciate board member Fortune's comment, definitely. But I think what our CFO alluded to at the budget hearing is not every situation is that situation. I believe there may be some scenarios that we get funds for them and it doesn't exceed what we would send out. So I think she stated that she would go do a deeper dive into those scenarios, because in some scenarios it very well may work out for us, in some it does not. It's when they are labeled special education, then they have door-to-door, so it's layers to that of why it exceeds. And sometimes I believe it may work in our benefit, possibly. But she was going to do a deeper dive into the different case types so we can know. Maybe it is after that review, maybe it is like, is a wash. Maybe it's just we don't. But I think it's another layer we probably would explore before coming to that conclusion.
Okay. Thank you, Chairwoman. I think I want to give our CFO an opportunity to respond. I think she wants to respond to this. So Caitlin, if you want to go ahead. And
Sorry,
then
I
we'll
was
go
trying
to
to
the rest
figure
of the
out
board members.
how to raise my hand, and it was very embarrassing because I don't know how. But I just figured that out. So yes, I think, and this is timely because Board Finance Committee on Monday, I'm going to share some of that deeper analysis. And I would say overall, what is true is that for open choice, that is where there's a net deficit for Hartford Public Schools. So specifically with suburban districts. And as you mentioned, board chair, it's really related to the special education expenses. And so we're going to take a deeper dive into why that is, because it's actually true that we only get half the ECS funding for open choice students versus we get the full ECS funding when they go to a CREC magnet school. And so there's a lot of nuance there. And so I think both things are true. There are scenarios in which we are losing out in the choice system. And I think we could particularly focus on those. And that one is it's open choice. And then the other piece is something that was raised on the agenda, which is the door-to-door transportation. And I wanted to add to that piece, the state is responsible under Sheff versus O'Neill for paying for transportation for general education, general transportation. They are not currently responsible for paying for door-to-door transportation. And so there's a piece in there. So I think what we're talking about and how I've conceptualized of this, there's things that can increase how much money we get. There's things that can decrease how much money we pay. And then there's a shifting of responsibility of costs, right? And so I would put both of those things in that structure. The special education costs for students who engage in open choice, part of that being transportation for door to door and who is responsible for that, would be areas that would be significantly impactful for us financially. And obviously should have the lens of supporting students who are special education, who are engaging in a complex choice system, right? Ultimately is at the heart of that. So we are going to talk more at Monday's board finance, but that's the summary. And as you were talking through some of the areas, I was comparing it to some of the list I made, and those were definitely two of them. So responsibility for door-to-door transportation and responsibility for special education, or how we fund it for Hartford students engaging in open choice. And then just while I'm talking, I'm just going to add a couple things. The fully funding of the seed grant makes sense. Excess cost makes sense. One other piece of that legislation that had the seed grant in it was about rate setting for special education tuition. And I think it's important that that hasn't happened yet. And from what I heard, it was going to be a 3-year process of the state determining those special education tuition rates, because that is another piece, both for our students engaging in school choice where we pay special ed tuition, and for our own outplaced students, that if there was set rates for that would be impactful to, especially how much that's been increasing over time. And so some type of follow-up on what the process looks like for rate setting of special ed at the state level. And then the two other pieces I'll add, and then I will be quiet. One, on this theme of Chef versus O'Neill related funding, in addition to the exchanges of payments that are happening between districts. So the money that we pay to CREC, the money that we pay to suburban districts, there's also a lot of state grant money out there for the school choice program. So for magnet schools, open choice schools, both the magnet operating grant, but also competitive grants. And I think there's something in that category of there's a set aside amount of state discretionary funding for Chef versus O'Neill, and a question of how much of that is going to Hartford Public Schools that I think we need to look into, because ultimately that funding is meant to benefit Hartford resident students. And I think we should get a better handle on, of that money that's already out there, it's millions of dollars, how much of that is being allocated to Hartford Public Schools. And then the final piece, and I will rest my case, is the other thing floating around is the school and state finance team is talking to districts about advocating for an inflation adjustment to the ECS formula. That's something that would be widely supported by a bunch of districts. And we're actually meeting with them on Monday to talk about essentially what are the ways in which inflation impacts our budget, and how every year when we have the same amount of funding, it's actually a decreased real dollars because there's less we can afford with it. And so I just wanted to add that to the discussion as well, because I know that there's an advocacy movement kind of around that, and that would be something that's statewide versus the other pieces I've talked about are more to the Hartford region and specifically related to Chef versus O'Neill and special ed.
Thank you. And what I hear from this is that we should definitely have a conversation with you, CFO, to clean up some of these like goals, because you understand the money and the ways that they operate, and make sure that we have those sort of like items really clear and concrete, both in this task force, but just in general when we're talking about it. I see a couple of hands, so I'm gonna go in order of when I saw them. We're gonna go Board Member Tyrone Walker, Board Member Stephen Tatum, HPS Union President Carol Gale, and then Parent University Lead Milia Siniagas. Tyrone, you can kick us off.
Yeah, thank you. Let me open by saying that I want to co-sign on the last comment that CFO Richard brought up about the school and finance folks. I'd heard something about that this week as well, and I think it would be worthwhile for us to coalesce on that issue, because they're obviously statewide coalition. But CFO Richard, I also want to lift up to you. I heard in that conversation that there are lots of flavors of how financing is done, and I realized we don't really understand the complexity of it. So maybe helpful to do some kind of breakout just for us to help us understand all the flavors, because I thought there was just one flavor of financing, and there's a lot of funding formulas out there, and so I'm just putting that out there as an action that will, I think, help us be more sophisticated in this kind of discussion. What I wanted to lift up, though, individually was to advocate for that expanding that seed money. There was seed money that was given to us so that we could build capacity to do special ed services in-house, to build that capacity, because in essence, that would lead to downstream savings. And so I'm thinking it's worthwhile to advocate for expanding that particular seed money, because it's not us asking for more money. In this situation, we're really asking for the resources to build in savings. There's downstream savings, and we can accelerate those savings being realized if we can get the resource money now versus having it dribble out over the next 5 years. And so I would say, of the seed things to kind of advocate for, I want to advocate for that one, because it's one that is both beneficial to us and beneficial to the state. And then I would also end by saying, and if, again, CFO Richards, we can figure out those rates that will make the amount of savings better to quantify.
Thank you, Board Member Walker. I just wanted to lift up something before we move over to Board Member Tatum from Union Leader Carl Gale for HPS teachers. She was just making sure that that she wanted to add to the idea of shifting responsibility for cause. Whatever district enrolls a special education student should be the district that owns the IEP for that student, and therefore the cost for special education for that student her understanding is that this occurs for choice students, but not for magnets. So it should be for both. So we should definitely get clear about that.
And I will just add, it's the reverse. The point is well taken, but it's actually we are involved in magnet school, but not open choice. And it's actually one of the reasons I hypothesize open choice is we see a bigger gap in expenses.
That's a great clarity point. We'll make sure we get that back to her as well. Board Member Tatum and then Millie Arciniegas.
Thanks, y'all. So grateful for this conversation. My question, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding the like nature of the short session versus long session in terms of the strategies and priorities that we're articulating here and that Nicole and Patrick both shared. Am I correct that like what's coming up here from February to May, we're still operating in the framework of the previous budget, which is why like we're seeing the points that you lifted, Nicole, as far as offensive strategies are not like substantively different from what was passed last time. It's like, okay, given what was passed last session, let's make sure that we're really kind of like all in on that, like fully funding those programs that were passed as part of the last budget, and not so much proposing new ideas or shifts. Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, I think that's a correct assessment. I'd say like we describe it as offensive only because at this point that funding still is not fully funded. And as Board Member Walker stated, there's a bunch of savings to be had with those additional funds once we can get them. So I think you're correct. It's about making sure that, the things that were started last year, reminding folks that we need to come back to those. And then obviously, I think, the busing issue will be a new aspect to that we can also bring to the conversation.
Thanks for that clarification. For me, I think part of what will help us build credibility and like also not lose sight of the bigger picture is like being able at the same time to advocate and articulate for and advocate for the like revisions and the things that are possible this session, while also explaining kind of how this fits in a bigger picture that needs to shift. Because I think the space that I kind of felt like I was in my first time around last session, and I guess it was a little different because it was a long session, was kind of this like really big picture, like we need radical change, but not really being able to fine tune that message, or really know what the nuances of what advocating, for example, like one special ed change that I think had some traction but didn't end up having the funding for was the idea of adding the special education weight to the ECS formula. Like not losing sight of a proposal like that would bring in significant dollars to districts across the state, and understanding how that fits into what feels possible this session, and then the more Hartford specific stuff, as well as what this idea that's kind of new to me about shifting the responsibility for costs. All that to say, I think like when you're preparing some of those like support materials for us as we're preparing for public testimony, like being able to a little bit do both, like speak to what's possible right now while still illuminating the broader context of what's possible, but what is needed, I think will help us in the long-term strategy of not just getting like little scraps here and there each session, but building toward a persuasive case about the more significant change that really is required. So just offering that.
That's really helpful. And, I think part of what we want to do is make sure that that narrative building that we're doing, it's also part of this conversation as we're building for the longer term conversations as well. So the clearer we could be about that, I think the better. One of the things that we wanted to make sure we did this year is that we're not actually naming the fact that students need special education, but rather that's the problem, because our special education kids deserve to have the resources that they need. They are not the problem. The problem is a system that underfunds these programs, for as an example. But in general, I think it would be helpful to your point about that larger narrative conversation, if I understood correctly. Millie, go ahead.
I just have a question and a comment. Um, are we still held harmless at 22,000 kids when it comes to the funding, even if we have less than 22,000 kids? Is
Yeah.
that still a,
We will never receive less ECS funding. And
okay,
so we are held harmless. Yes. In that
okay, because, as we were advocating in the past for more funding, that's where we got trapped because they're saying, okay, well, wait a minute, you get paid for 22,000 kids. We only have 15,000 kids, so what do you need more money for? And this is us talking to the education committee members. Legislatively, we were trying to advocate for more funding, and that was always the case, right? So I think if we could say, okay, yeah, thank you for the 22, keeping us at the 22,000, not 22,000 kids, but here is the difference. We have more special ed kids. We have 4,000 kids. And this is what it really cost us in a simple way so that families that do want to advocate, right? Special families that have special education, that have special needs students, they can really own in on that, right? So like, yeah, thank you, but this is what we're receiving, but we really need to be here for my child to be able to have a quality, equitable education. And I think that's when you make it simple like that, it just resonates more with the legislators because and then they were like, okay, well, 4,000 kids, maybe we can't give them all of it, but we can meet them halfway, and more families will probably be more apt to go out there and speak on their story. Just a thought.
That's really helpful because I think part of the conversation we're having is not just about more funding, but it's about the funding that isn't being met. Like there's things that was promised that we didn't get fully, but I definitely noted on the idea of like how many students we have versus the need and even with the number of students, the amount of need that's there. Caitlin, I saw you unmuted. I didn't know if you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I totally agree centering the student experience part. And actually, we are financially responsible for all 22,000 of those students. So when we pay tuition and we pay transportation, we're still responsible. And I think that that's the places where we can get really nuanced of. And when that student is engaging in the open choice system and they have special education needs, we actually only get half the ECS funding and it's not enough to cover that. And so I think to your point, it's both and like, what's the student experience of students in Hartford? And we actually are financially responsible for all of those students, and it looks differently depending on where they go.
Board Member Tatum, thank you. CFO Richard.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding this because I feel like every time I like hear a little bit of it and it doesn't always stick. So we receive ECS funding for Hartford resident students, regardless of where they choose to attend school, except that we only get half of ECS funding for those students who enroll in open choice, which is when they attend a school district operated by a neighboring municipality. Is that correct?
Yes, this really makes me want to show my slides for Monday. That's exactly it. Yes, yes. What you said is correct.
And the idea that Millie just mentioned is this like hold harmless part, whereby we don't receive less funding than at some point that was determined.
So this part is that alliance districts, so that's a subset of districts in the state, it's the large urban areas that receive part of their ECS funding through the alliance grant, are held harmless from ever receiving less of that total ECS plus alliance grant funding. The reason for that is that other districts, their funding is determined. It's 2 years prior on October 1st, how many resident students were there in the district with the various formulas. for us, if we were to experience a decline in the total number of resident students in Hartford over the course of time, we're not going to be penalized for that. And so that's really what that is saying. And so there is a nuanced piece in there of like, we are not going to decrease that total amount of funding if there's a decrease or change in needs of Hartford resident students over time. And then there's the layer on top of that that's like what we get based on how students are choosing the choice system and what we have to pay out. But yes, that is true for all Alliance districts. Yes.
Right. Okay. So like when we look, there's kind of two things that are interesting with that. It's like when we look at our HPS declining enrollments, we're not receiving any less ECS money, with the possible exception that if that declining enrollment is going to open choice, then we're only getting half ECS for those kids. But it's not going to be less than what we got for 22,000 students. Like is there a point where the individual choices that families are making will affect the amount of revenue that we get from ECS, I guess is my question.
I get what you're saying now. Let me think about that a little bit just because it's really complicated. I see what you're saying. If families started to make, if we had the same number of, say, resident families, but some of them are making different choices, would it actually impact us negatively revenue-wise because we are held harmless? Let me look into that further, and then we could talk about that Monday.
Okay.
Because it's complicated, and I want to better understand it.
Yeah, and I appreciate the complexity, obviously, and I think it's important because, like, the I want to avoid sort of like turning kids into dollars in these conversations a little bit. Like, I see the tendency to do that, and like at the end of the day, like families are going to make choices for their education, for the education of their students, their children. And it's adults' responsibility, like, to create a system whereby we can do that, and no one is like suffering for it. You know what I mean? And I just want us to not be like misinformed when we're talking about the impact of the choices that families are making financially. And the nuance of like, how does that affect revenue versus how does it affect our expenses is interesting. So I look forward to more, and thank you for looking into it.
Did we lose?
I just realized I think we Krista.
Yeah, I
Oh,
think we
no.
lost the advocacy task
The
force
chair.
chair.
Yeah. Any other comments, questions? Let me call her in the meantime.
While we wait, I do want to say thank you all for your comments, and I think overall they have a similar message, right? And I think that it does speak to board member Tatum's thoughts about making sure we're weaving both, current policies in with that bigger picture transformational change. And I do think I plan to watch CFO Richard's presentation on Monday, but I do think that using that message, once we have that information and crafting that, I think that actually fits in really well with both. We need, things fixed right now, but this is why things are going wrong, because it's a systemic issue. So I think that really will weave the two messages together. I don't want to make any decisions without Krister here, but we will definitely at least revise these to reflect the conversations that we've had so far. And then I'll work with Krister to decide, do we need to send them around to everyone, have another meeting? I think it would be good for us to probably chat with CFO Richard as well to make sure that, as Krister stated, that our goals are really aligned with the broader financial picture.
Thanks, Nicole. And Caitlin, I think that whatever material you have for the meeting on Monday would be helpful for us to see after the meeting. And if there's a way for us to listen in to that meeting. I think that would be helpful to both Nicole and myself.
For sure, yeah. And that'll be like, that's publicly available too. So we'll make sure to send it to you.
Perfect. Thanks.
Well, it seems like her device died because it goes straight to voicemail. So if nothing else, we will make sure to follow it with notes. Future calendar invites. We already have some dates through January, seeing as though we're going to get started in February. And if nothing else,
So just so everyone knows, we have next steps. We'll work on, editing those goals and talking to CFO Richard, and then we'll get back to you all.
okay. And yes, I will do that. So I will make sure all board members are at this finance committee, seeing as how
I've really talked it up. I hope.
I know, right?
I gotta get working on that.
Monday.
better live up to it.
I know. I'm like, I hope I didn't overpromise.
I am sure I will. You will.
It feels a little bit like a serialized TV show where it's like tune in next time for the dramatic conclusion, you know?
Yeah. And Stephen,
the next
oh,
chapter.
sorry, go ahead. I appreciate you reframing it again and again, because I hear this again and again. It is so complicated for us, for the viewing audience. So thank you for just keep pushing how to understand this.
Yeah, my journey with it has been like, I felt like I had a really steep learning curve at the beginning of like trying to like wrap my head around this. And I made a lot of progress very quickly, but now it's like flattened out and I feel like kind of slower like pieces falling into place and the fog is lifting a little bit. But yeah, I'm with you. I'm and trying to figure out how to communicate about it so that, like I sympathize a lot with the legislators who, I've been like really prioritizing trying to learn this as it impacts Hartford here for a couple of years now, and it's still slow, and legislators have so much else on their plate, which is why I'm interested in the communication about it. Like how can we break it down so that we don't run into those hiccups. I'm glad that you brought up that point that like the roadblock that we hit is they say like, what's the problem? And being able to navigate that conversation and be able to like be like, yeah, you're right, and here's what else is up, will really help our credibility, I think, and help us make progress so that they can't just sort of, as someone else, as I think it was Ruth mentioned, like they kind of just dismiss it as like, you don't need any more money, but there must be something else wrong. So looking forward to continuing that effort with everybody.
Well, thank you.